So, what actually happens when a country just runs out of prison space? Well, right now in the UK, we're seeing a justice system totally backed into a corner. And not by a lack of funding or personnel, but literally by a lack of bricks, mortar, and steel. The nation is hitting an absolute physical wall. They have simply run out of room. We aren't just talking about theoretical policy debates here. This is an urgent, operational crisis unfolding right in front of us.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most controversial and honestly the most pressing systemic issues gripping the UK right now, the prison overcrowding and early release crisis. We're going to make sense of this deeply complex, rapidly evolving situation. Because as you'll see, a literal lack of physical space has forced the government's hand into making some incredibly difficult, high-stakes choices.
Okay, let's dive right in. We'll start by looking at the overcrowding crisis itself, then the early release scheme, and those serious probation warnings. After that, we'll examine the victims' outcry, some very urgent grooming concerns, and finally, the massive political fallout this whole thing is generating.
Section 1. The overcrowding crisis and a system at capacity. Now, before we can even begin to debate the politics of this, we really have to understand the absolute physical reality that's forcing the government's hand here.
The UK government is facing a severe, frankly unprecedented lack of available prison cells. And look, this isn't a problem they can just kick down the road for some future administration to deal with. It demands an immediate fix. Multiple reports are showing that when these cells are full, the normal mechanics of the justice system, from sentencing to holding people on remand, just start to grind to a halt. It's like a giant bottleneck. The government has basically been forced into a corner where doing nothing means risking the complete collapse of law enforcement's ability to operate.
Moving on to Section 2, the early release scheme, which is the government's proposed solution. So think about it. How do you actually free up space when you simply don't have the time or the resources to build brand new prisons overnight?
Well, the mechanics of their plan operate in two distinct steps. First, authorities identify eligible offenders currently in the system who might qualify for early release. Second, they release those individuals to serve the remainder of their sentences on the outside, in our communities. The raw logic is pretty straightforward, right? You reduce the headcount inside the physical walls to keep the entire system from just totally collapsing. But as you can imagine, executing this policy is incredibly complex. It is fraught with risk, and it relies entirely on having a really robust safety net waiting for these folks on the outside.
Which brings us to Section 3, probation warnings, and the question of whether safety is in jeopardy. Because once prisoners are released early, they don't just disappear into thin air. They enter the probation system. And the folks running that system, well, they are sounding the alarm.
The pushback from the front lines here is absolutely staggering. According to reports from Channel 4 and ITV, the probation union has explicitly come out and stated that this early release scheme is simply not safe. There are some very serious, pressing questions being raised about whether current probation services actually have the capacity and the resources to protect the public. They are deeply, deeply concerned about managing this rapid influx of early release prisoners. It's a classic systemic bottleneck. By trying to solve the capacity issue inside the prisons, they're actively overwhelming the safety net on the outside.
Section 4. Victims' outcry and the human cost. You see, beyond all the logistics of cell space and probation officers, there is a profound human cost to this policy. For the families of victims and the survivors of crimes, this isn't just some administrative shuffle.
Appalled. That is the exact word used by an investigating officer speaking to ITV regarding the potential early release of the killers of P.C. Harper. And this specific case has really become a powerful anchor for public outrage. For victims' families, seeing offenders released before their full sentences are served, well, it feels like a direct betrayal of justice. It brings this immense emotional toll that spreadsheets and capacity charts simply cannot capture, and it really highlights the incredibly difficult tension between systemic necessity and individual justice.
Section 5. Grooming concerns and the need for urgent identification. Because as the government rushes to implement this scheme, we're seeing some highly sensitive, frankly dangerous complications start to emerge.
Specifically, a pretty terrifying loophole has opened up regarding grooming cases. Officials are now scrambling, and I mean urgently scrambling, to identify specific grooming offenders. Because of the sheer rush to free up space, there's a very real fear that these highly manipulative, dangerous individuals might slip right through the cracks of the early release scheme and be inadvertently freed into the public. It perfectly highlights the massive operational risk of pushing through rapid, systemic changes without the granular data you actually need to protect the most vulnerable people in society.
So all of these moving parts, the overflowing cells, the overwhelmed probation officers, the devastated victims, and these dangerous loopholes, they all culminate in Section 6, political fallout and Burnham's first big test.
This whole situation is building into a massive, massive test for the nation's leadership. The Times actually draws a direct comparison here. Where a former Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, previously failed to adequately resolve the prisoners issue, current Prime Minister Andy Burnham is now attempting a brand new strategy. Burnham's approach relies heavily on trying to take voters along with him, basically trying to convince the public that these drastic early release measures are a necessary, if bitter, pill to swallow.
But bringing those voters along is proving incredibly difficult, especially amid these fiercely polarized media narratives. On one side, you've got voices in The Guardian describing the early release scheme as the ultimate sign of a fundamentally broken prison system. They see it as a complete systemic failure. Then, on the other end of the spectrum, The Sun is publishing these powerful editorials arguing that Britain has simply had enough of soft justice. So, the government is completely caught in a political minefield right now. They're being accused simultaneously of mismanaging a crumbling system and being way too lenient on crime.
Sky News recently captured this tension perfectly. They asked, is this policy a victory for systemic reform or a kick in the teeth to families and victims? Commentators are actively questioning whether Prime Minister Burnham's bold intervention on this crisis risks making some seriously damaging mistakes. I mean, if the probation service fails, or if the wrong offender is released by accident, this crisis has the absolute potential to abruptly end his political honeymoon.
Which really leaves us with a lingering, provocative question. Can the justice system actually successfully balance rehabilitation, the harsh reality of physical space, and the paramount need for public safety? The physical walls of these prisons, they aren't going to move anytime soon, but the pressure inside them just continues to build. How this is navigated is going to define the UK's justice system for a generation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.